So you might already know that the Super Game Boy allows you to play Game Boy games on your Super Nintendo console, but do you really know everything else that it can do? It's time to go in depth with the Super Game Boy and show you that it does a whole lot more than just give you a bigger screen to play your portable games. Way back in 2015, I did a brief video about the Super Game Boy, its Japanese exclusive follow-up, and Hori's Game Boy style controller that was designed to be the perfect controller for both editions. Since then, I still use the Super Game Boy for playing my original Game Boy games, and since I produced that initial video, I've learned even more about this awesome Super Nintendo peripheral. And as a result, I've realised that a running time of 3 minutes 51 seconds is nowhere near long enough to cover any one of these items individually, let alone all three. So it felt like a good idea to just cover the Super Game Boy and all of its related paraphernalia in a lot more depth, starting with the peripheral that started it all. Released in 1994, relatively late in the original Game Boy's lifespan, the Super Game Boy was an ingenious idea, allowing Super Nintendo owners to play games originally designed for the Game Boy handheld on their television screens. With the Game Boy's technical specifications already being well outdated even when the original system appeared in 1989, this peripheral released at a pretty cheap price of £49.99 here in the UK and $59.99 in North America. Noticeably larger than a standard SNES cartridge, with the North American NTSC version made to match the boxiness of their own console as opposed to the curvier version released in Japan and PAL regions, the Super Game Boy shares the same innards as the Game Boy console, only relying on the SNES hardware for its controller input and audio-video output. For the most part, it acts exactly like a proper Game Boy should, although its CPU runs slightly faster due to apparently relying on the Super Nintendo's clock speed rather than its own, something that can be fixed nowadays with a modification to the hardware. Now with that said, most players wouldn't know the difference, but if you listen to any Game Boy game's music and compare the Super Game Boy to the original hardware, you may well notice that the music is slightly higher pitched than it is when playing it on the proper Game Boy system. But beyond its primary purpose of acting as a means of televisual output, the Super Game Boy's most lauded, and ironically its most underused, features were related to the many ways that it was possible to extend the audio and visual elements of Game Boy games, allowing them to do things that were never possible on the aging 8-bit handhelds. But before I get onto that, let's just take a look at the Super Game Boy's built-in functionality. Using the Super Game Boy is a simple process. Insert your original Game Boy or backwards compatible Game Boy Color cartridge into the peripheral, plug the whole thing into your SNES and then switch the console on. After a short splash screen, your inserted game will load just like it would on the original system. Using the standard SNES controller, you can open up the Super Game Boy's menu by pressing L and R together, but if you plug the SNES mouse into the second controller port, you can click both buttons at the same time to open the menu, and navigating it using the mouse. If you happen to have Hori's excellent Super Game Boy Commander controller, the controls are simplified somewhat, and you can actually open up the menu by pressing the R button on that controller. And I'll be covering the Super Game Boy Commander in depth in its own video, so stay tuned for that one, because this Hori-made controller offers a lot of additional features for Super Game Boy owners, which I will of course be delving into another time. When you open the main menu, you'll be given 5 different options, all offering different features. From left to right, they go Color Palette Selector, Border Selector, Controller Setup, Custom Colour Palettes and Graffiti. Let's take a closer look at what each one does. The Colour Palette Selector is pretty explanatory. The Super Game Boy improves upon the original Game Boy handheld with the ability to display games in different colours rather than different shades of green or black. And while the stock Game Boy displays up to 4 different shades of a colour, the Super Game Boy can change those 4 colours independently. While a handful of Game Boy games labelled as Super Game Boy compatible have their own default colour palette, consisting of many more colours than the 4 that are usually allowed, if you aren't happy with the look of your Super Game Boy display, you can pick your own palette from several pages of different colour schemes, which you cycle through by selecting the numbered button. Of course, there's even the option for the Game Boy's classic green hues, or even just plain black, grey and white if you prefer the Game Boy Pocket's colour scheme. While most original Game Boy games default to the first palette, certain early Game Boy games are picked up by the Super Game Boy and will actually use a preset palette. Games like Metroid 2 Return of Samus, Alleyway and Kirby's Pinball Land are just a few of the games that load up these preset palettes, and there are plenty more, most Nintendo published releases in fact. But if you're playing certain Super Game Boy enabled games, you'll be able to play with more than just the 4 standard hues per palette. Games like Donkey Kong 94 show off this functionality rather well for differentiating gameplay visuals from the user interface, and the Pokemon series of games offer a subtle but extremely effective use of these features for battles, where the fighting monsters are coloured differently. The palette will even change automatically when you change areas. For these Super Game Boy enabled games with a default palette, a button will be available to switch back to this default scheme if you changed it and want to go back. Back up to the main menu, and next up is the border selector. Now you may have noticed that the game display doesn't take up the entire screen, and the rest of the display is filled with a rather pedestrian border, although you can change this to one of several included on the Super Game Boy. Some Super Game Boy supported games will automatically load up a game exclusive border from memory, with some games even offering multiple borders that are displayed when needed. So let's show you exactly what I mean. If I were to take a bog standard older Game Boy game, everything would load exactly as normal. However, if I were to load up a game like Pokemon Blue, a custom border will be loaded. Even better, if I was to load up the Game Boy port of Street Fighter 2, the border will change on the fly depending on what country you're fighting in. It's not an instantaneous process, and of course it is purely cosmetic, but it's still a pretty clever feature. At this point, it's also worth mentioning that some Super Game Boy games have hidden borders that are only accessible through button press codes. For example, at first glance, Mario's Picross has a border for its title screen and a green Game Boy border for the game itself. However, depending on what buttons you press to get past the title screen, you'll get a few different borders, all revolving around different coloured Play It Loud era Game Boys. Pressing start on its own will get you that green Game Boy as normal, but pressing left and start together and you'll get a yellow Game Boy. Up and start will get you black, right and start will get you red, and down and start will get you a bright white Game Boy. But there's another border, which is unlocked in a slightly more complex manner. On the title screen, slowly press up, down, left and right in any order you want. One of those directions will cause a tone to be played, and once you hear it, don't press any other direction and just press A or start. This will load up a hidden transparent Game Boy border. Space Invaders is another game with a hidden border. When playing the standard Super Game Boy mode, you're given a border that represents the classic upright cabinet, but if you pause the game and press A, the border will fade away and change to the alternate cocktail version of the cabinet. Pretty cool, huh? Next up on the menu is the rather self-explanatory controller setup. There's not really much to see here, just the option to change whether the B button on your SNES pad acts as either the A or B buttons on the Game Boy. Let's move on. The fourth option is probably the one that's the most fun, the custom colour mode. While the colour palette menu allows to select from several pages of predefined colour palettes, in this menu you can make your own from scratch. You can change each of the 4 shades of colour to anything you want, and it's quite fun to find the perfect combination for the game you're playing. Wish the background in Metroid 2 was a nice shade of purple? Go ahead and do it. Want to make all the sprites in Super Mario Land the same colour as the background to make the game harder? Be my guest. You can even change how light and dark each colour is as well, so there's a lot of things to fiddle around with in here. While your custom palette is deleted when you turn the console off, the custom colour screen features a 12-digit code you can record and then type in the next time you play to retain your perfect colour scheme. So you've got the game looking as perfect as can be, but what if you don't like the predefined borders on offer? Well, why not make your own with the graffiti function? In this mode, you're given some very basic drawing tools in which you can customise your border in any way you see fit. Whether it's doodling or using it to somehow write down notes and passwords, you can pretty much do what you like in here, even enabling a function to draw over the screen as well. And I'm not sure how useful this function is, to be honest, but hey, who doesn't like extra features? And you can even use the SNES mouse to draw instead of the unwieldy SNES controller D-pad. Once you've made your border, you can select it at any time using the far right icon in the border menu, and unfortunately you can't actually save your hard scribbled artwork, so once you turn the system off it's gone forever, so it's probably not worth spending too much time on your masterpiece. The Super Game Boy's own player's guide suggests connecting your Super Nintendo to the VCR and recording it via that way, but I have no idea why you'd actually do that. So that's pretty much the official feature set for the Super Game Boy. But what about the stuff that Nintendo don't tell you in the manual? The hidden stuff, the really cool stuff that few people know about. Well, I've got you covered there as always. Did you know that most of the selectable borders also double up as screensavers? The Game Boy, black and user created borders don't actually do anything, but if you pick any other border and leave your Game Boy alone for a few minutes, animations will start to play. If you pick the theatre, then you actually see the audience start to get restless, fall asleep, or even play their own Game Boys. Meanwhile, the signpost border displays an entire day and night cycle, complete with a sky full of stars that is certainly a sight to behold. But before you go and leave your Super Game Boy idle for ages and ages, there's actually a hidden code to instantly start these screensavers without waiting. Just type in this code at any time. L, 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 R. You'll hear a sound, and the screensaver will play. And you know those user-created borders and how they don't have a screensaver? Well, they kind of sort of do. While you're creating a graffiti border, draw something, and then leave the controller alone for a little while. Your scribblings will actually be cleaned up by a tiny little man. What about other cheats? Well, there is one more, even if it doesn't do anything of particular interest. When loading the Super Game Boy, or any time during gameplay, when the logo pops up, you need to type in the following button combination: LLL, RRR, LLL, RRRRRRR. The credits screen will play. Now, don't expect anything particularly exciting, it is just a black screen with white text with names on. However, it is worth noting that these credits do reveal that the Super Game Boy's hardware was created by Hori, so the existence of the Super Game Boy Commander controller makes a lot more sense. But for those looking for the ultimate in Super Game Boy's undocumented features, I'd like to finish up with some rarely used features that are actually pretty damn cool. If you've been paying attention so far, you'll know that certain Super Game Boy labelled games could display different 4-colour palettes, or even palettes that display more than 4 colours. But something that the Super Game Boy could also do, other than upgrade Game Boy games visuals, was upgrade their audio as well. Donkey Kong 94 was an early experiment in this functionality, adding short voice samples when played on Super Game Boy. Konami seemed to be one of the few publishers that actually bothered to take advantage of this, more specifically the games that Factor 5 developed. Their port of the SNES's Contra 3 The Alien Wars seems pretty normal, except when you listen to the audio. It seems that the Super Game Boy has a small library of sound effects that Super Game Boy enabled games can make use of, and that is in full ability here. Going further with this idea is Konami's Maniacs. Now, this game should be your typical uninspired licensed game, especially as it's just a cut down port of the Sega Mega Drive version of the title. But as another Factor 5 developed release, they've gone above and beyond what you'd expect in terms of how audio is handled, because this game has 2 entirely different soundtracks. There's the standard one you hear when played on a standard Game Boy, but there's also an entirely different one that is exclusive to the Super Game Boy, one that uses the SNES's sound capabilities, and interestingly, it's the Mega Drive soundtrack, retooled to use the SNES. It's an insane amount of work for a game that could have easily been forgotten, but it's pretty cool that they did. After spending a little bit of time with the Super Game Boy, you begin to realise the limitations and wasted potential. Something that would have made the Super Game Boy a real game changer would be if the peripheral could use the power of the SNES to draw better graphics for Super Game Boy enabled games. Well, the Super Game Boy technically had that ability, but in Nintendo's technical documentation, developers were prohibited from using it. If it had actually been used, the idea is that the Super Game Boy could have drawn sprites over the Game Boy display using the SNES's video memory, leaving the Super Game Boy's video memory to continue to draw the Game Boy display as is. There is only one known released game that shipped with this function still intact, Mario's Picross. Now, how did this game use this potentially awesome feature? Well, to stop the game's logo on the title screen from changing colour when you change the game's colour palette. There were quite a few multiplayer games on the Game Boy, although you needed a Game Link cable, multiple Game Boys and a copy of the game each to actually play them with other people. Sadly, the first edition of the Super Game Boy didn't have the facility to link with other Game Boys. That would come later with the second edition of the peripheral. But what it could do was let you use multiple SNES controllers to play certain Super Game Boy enabled games in multiplayer. Wario Blast was a Bomberman game with the addition of Wario, and using a multi-tap and 4 SNES controllers, up to 4 players could play its multiplayer battle mode on the television. Other than Wario Blast, the use of multiplayer via the Super Game Boy was mostly relegated to fighting games, and there were a ton of those, everything from Killer Instinct to of course Street Fighter. Even the likes of Battle Arena Toshinden and King of Fighters had Game Boy ports, and all of these games added the ability to play multiplayer matchups on the SNES, but surely if you had a SNES you'd be playing the superior SNES versions of Street Fighter and all of these other fighters. Finally, would you like to see the smallest official SNES cartridge in existence? It's the Super Game Boy version of Space Invaders, and its support for Super Game Boy is completely unique, even if the game itself isn't. Loading it up on a standard Game Boy will give you the most basic form of Space Invaders you've probably ever seen, and I can't imagine this game being a worthwhile purchase unless you own a Super Game Boy. With this combination, the bulk of the game is unlocked. Loading up the game in a Super Game Boy gives you two options, Super Game Boy mode and arcade mode. Now selecting the former option gives you various different configurations of the basic black and white version of Space Invaders, including the representation of the black and white game with coloured cellophane, which was actually done to the original arcade machines at the time. Plus, there was also a basic colour version. But more interesting things happen when you pick the arcade mode, because it loads up a 16-bit SNES version of Space Invaders, including all the game modes of the Super Game Boy game, only better. Granted, it is still Space Invaders after all, and as such it's not exactly a technologically demanding game, but it is by definition a Super Nintendo game on a Game Boy cartridge, and as such it's the only game to do this. The Super Game Boy was a fantastic idea and had a ton of amazing features. The problem is that, well, not enough developers really made use of them. Sure, plenty of games had special borders, but very few went beyond that. Imagine if more developers had hidden exclusive 16-bit versions of games, or better audio. Alas, it was not to be, but for a long time this was the definitive way to play Game Boy games on your television, at least until the Japanese exclusive Super Game Boy 2. But that is a story I'll be telling another time, more specifically next week, when I'll take a look at the improved Super Game Boy that never made it to the West. So did you own a Super Game Boy? Were there any Super Game Boy enhanced games that you loved? I'd love to hear your own Super Game Boy memories, so why not share them in the comments below for us all to read. Hopefully you've enjoyed this first part of an in-depth look at a truly awesome peripheral, and I'd really appreciate it if you just took a moment just to subscribe to Pughoof Gaming for more gaming videos just like this one. If you have friends that you think would enjoy this video, why not tell them all about it?